last week, Meta released a new open source model, their Llama 3.1. And you might have seen headlines with the model being compared to other closed source models such as ChatGPT-4, Claude. And with this latest news, I thought it would be a great opportunity to explain the differences between open and closed source models, as some might not know the underlying details, and ultimately to provide greater context as to why this news is so important. So with that, let's get started. Oop, a little too far. So to start off our comparison between closed source and open source models, first going to talk about closed source because that is what everyone is most familiar with when it comes to ChatGPT and Claude. So for our main players in the game when it comes to closed source models, we have, despite its name, OpenAI, so not open at all, Claude, and Google's Gemini. As for open source, one thing to note, there are so many open source models out there. I'm just highlighting a few, but Bloom, Mistral, and Meta with their Llama 3.1. And one of the things I do want to indicate before going through everything is that when it comes to open source models, it is very much a spectrum. You have some models that would be considered full open source, and other models that would be considered partial open source. So there's a lot that can fall within this category, but just for all intents and purposes and making things a little bit easier, I'm just going to keep it all in one. So as for one of the main differences is in regards to transparency. And you can kind of see this when it comes to what you have access to with these models. So when it comes to ChatGPT, Claude, all that LLM is proprietary. We get to use it, but the internal details, what goes on behind the scenes, that is all hidden from us. Now, that's far different than open source models where there is much greater transparency. You have some models like Bloom, which are full open source, and I mean, you're able to download the whole code base. So that is probably one of the bigger differences between closed and open source. And this kind of lends itself to the customizability. So when it comes to customization, for closed source models, you are limited to the provider's offerings. So what they offer, that's the extent of what you're able to do. However, with open source, there is a lot greater customization, and you can, we'll say, adapt the models more to your needs. As for deployment, this is another big difference between the two. So when it comes to closed source models, you can just think about how you access these models. So ChatGPT, you're going to their website to interact with it, or their APIs. So they're hosted in the cloud, and that's how you're accessing them. As for open source models, these can be run locally or on chosen infrastructure. So you could download a open source model and run it on your computer, or if you wanted to, you could download it to an external server and host it there. So you get a lot greater flexibility over where it's hosted and how you're running it. And this also leads itself to the data privacy, which is the next thing I want to talk about. When it comes to data privacy, for a closed source, that data is controlled by the provider. Simple example of this is when you are using ChatGPT's free version. When you are entering prompts, what you enter, that is used in training. You're subject to their terms and services. So yeah, that data is going to them. However, when it comes to open source models, you have control of your data. And this is a very important difference as to why open source, why there's a lot of power to open source and being able to have full control over your data. The last thing I want to mention is cost. So again, when you think about ChatGPT Plus, Claude's paid version, you're either paying for the subscription, API tokens, that's the paid service. Whereas open source, you could consider it as generally free. So if you could be running it locally, or you could be paying to host it somewhere else, and at that point you're just paying for hosting it. As for where Meta's Llama 3.1 falls, I would say that it falls on the left side of this open source category, or some might call it partially open source, just in terms of that there are limiting, or there's licensing restrictions, and you don't have full access to code base. So why is Meta's Llama 3.1 so important? Is because it's the first openly available AI model that rivals top proprietary models. And when I say top proprietary, we're referring to the frontier models like GPT-4, Claude, the ones that you hear about. So on this graph on the left-hand side, we have a plot of closed source models and how they perform on a certain metric compared to open source models. And one of the things that you see is, well, easiest thing to see is that the closed source outperform the open source models. But one of the things that I do want to highlight, again, I know that this, I'm going to call this out of date. It's like 3 months out of date, but in AI terms, it's out of date. But we have Llama 3.1, which is on par with many of the frontier models. And you can see that here, this is Llama 3.1. And its metrics when compared to 4, 4.0, and 3.5. So this is very important in just being able to see open source models, which can be argued for promoting greater democratization with LLMs to the broader public, that they are now being able to compete with proprietary models. So just wanted to share this video to explain the differences between open and closed source models to ultimately provide greater context as to why this news is so important. So I hope that you all enjoy this video, and I look forward to making the next one. So talk soon.